A while ago, I released a video over unique racial groups with very memorable physical appearance, culture, language, and genetics scattered all over the world, who for various reasons are in danger of dwindling down to extinction from this earth forever. And surprisingly, it was pretty well received, and I didn't really have any ulterior motives besides spreading information and entertainment, but many wanted me to compound on this since I had presented them with cultures and people most of them had never heard before. Well, today's video will be just that, discussing ancient, and in some cases not so ancient, groups of people that not only faced much of the same existential threats as the groups that I discussed, but eventually disappeared from this earth entirely, leaving only small relics of their presence in the people and landscapes that succeeded them. As I always say, the different lines of demarcation between some racial groups is quite blurred at times, and hence for this video I would classify most of them as sub-races or ethno-racial categories, not quite being distinct enough from others to declare as separate races, yet without a doubt are disparate enough to see their unique genetic and phenotypic qualities. So as I had mentioned, the genetic face of Asia has changed drastically in the past few thousand years in pretty much every corner of the continent. The quote-unquote racial borders were far more fluid in the past, which is a term I just made up to describe the boundaries that generally separate different racial groups, and in the present day these are far more static, having been codified by international borders. And in the past, the Caucasoid or Mongoloid peoples spread out throughout the continent, although I prefer to use the more modern terms of Western and Eastern Eurasians, respectively. As many know, Turkic, Uralic, and maybe even Hunnic groups have their origins in the Far East, and their invasions of Europe dating back millennia has left a minor genetic but major cultural impact on the continent. But there were also cases of large-scale migration and invasion from the West into the lands of the Far East, long before the travels of contemporary Europeans such as Marco Polo. The expansion of the Indo-Europeans out of the steppes of Eurasia gave birth to nearly all of the modern nations of Europe, Iran, and northern South Asia. But it's rather curious that there's a missing stretch of land that by all means should have connected the European and Indo-Iranian branches together. And there was, over 1,000 years ago. Haplogroups R1a and R1b are the genetic marker that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt the shared paternal heritage between all Indo-Europeans, and these haplogroups are still found in the gap of Central Asia and Anatolia today, albeit not at the same rates in the past because they were of course originally inhabited by Indo-Europeans, with those in Central Asia and the Eurasian steppes known as the Scythians. The Scythians and closely related groups such as the Sarmatians and Alans in the west were known by many ancient peoples to have dominated an area stretching from Eastern Europe all the way down to modern Afghanistan in the southeast and Altai in the northwest. Although speaking languages most closely related to the Iranian language family, by all historic descriptions, the Scythians and other steppe Indo-Europeans were very close in appearance to Europeans to the west, and most likely did have a degree of Eastern Eurasian admixture, but nowhere near the levels we see in modern Central Asians today, most likely 10 to 15%. Another group of ancient Indo-Europeans near to the Scythians were the Tocharians, who were quite possibly the farthest a group of non-Indian Western Eurasians had ever settled east in ancient history, with Tocharian settlements clustered in the Tarim Basin in modern China, located in the modern-day province of Xinjiang, very close to the civilizations of Tibet, China, and Mongolia. And judging from Oriental accounts on the Tocharians, their complexion could have ranged from that of Eastern Europeans, or perhaps was more in line with some other groups in the regions, such as the Nuristanis, Kashmiris, and other Dards of South Asia. Starting around the 5th century AD, large number of Turkic, Mongolic, and other tribes from the Far East began to settle in Central Asia, fundamentally changing the cultural and racial makeup of this region, and following the large-scale invasion and devastation wrought by the expanse of the Mongol Empire, the last of these ancient civilizations fell, and the people were absorbed by the incoming Turkic groups, creating a hybrid race that became the modern Turkic Central Asians. Other Scythians living west were later absorbed by the expanding Slavic nations, leaving the only remnant of this once great people, the Ossetians, a small group of Alans tucked away in the Caucasus Mountains. Descendants of the Scythians live on throughout Eurasia, particularly with people groups in Pakistan and India through Scythian invasions of the subcontinent, some Eastern Slavs, and the Turkic Central Asians. The Tocharians were likewise absorbed by the Turkic Uyghur tribe over several centuries, and the group most similar to the ancient Tocharians today in genetics and appearance would most likely be the Pamiris or Wakis of Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and eastern China. Although there were other claims of Indo-European tribes reaching the Far East, particularly the Xiongnu Confederation, none have yet to be verified, and it's worth noting that although the Indo-European Anatolians were indeed Turkified through the Seljuks, they retained the majority of their genetics, unlike the Central Asians. Another case of a region being completely transformed from a genetic and linguistic case would be the Canary Islands, which are far more than just a great holiday destination. The Canary Islands, located just off the coast of the Maghreb in the Atlantic Ocean, are sometimes considered to be a part of the African continent, and the indigenous group on this island chain, the Guanche, spoke an Afro-Asiatic language related to the modern Berber languages spoken in northwest Africa today, and distantly related to Arabic, Hebrew, Hausa, or even Somali. During the Reconquista, when the Spaniards and Portuguese were expelling the last of the Islamic Moors, they also attempted invasions of the mainland of Africa with limited success, but the Guanche were rather ripe for the conquest, having been isolated for thousands of years, and the only group in northwest Africa yet to be Islamized. The Guanche were described as very physically distinct from either the Iberians or the North African Muslim groups they had been combating for centuries and were overall very familiar with. Their most noteworthy trait was their height, described as quite tall with a reddish-brown complexion, having genetic connections to both Berbers from the mainland as well as ancient Europeans who had visited the islands. In a little under a century, the native Guanche were completely conquered, subjugated, and incorporated into the Spanish crown, and large-scale migration from the mainland of Spain commenced, intermixing with the native population, and within a generation their language and the last full-blooded member of this group disappeared, almost an analogy as a precursor for the Spanish conquest of the Americas, which would commence soon thereafter, ironically with many of the first migrants, officials, and explorers heading to the New World hailing from the Canary Islands. So, although the Guanche no longer exist, their descendants live on through the modern Canarians, with admixture varying depending on the island, some mainland Spaniards, and by extension an innumerable count in the Hispanic American countries, especially the Caribbean, where Canarian immigration was so extensive. Caribbean Spanish is most similar to that spoken in the Canaries, seeing how many Canarians were the first to settle on the islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, home to the Taino, coincidentally another extinct people. It would be difficult to describe the Taino as a unique race or subrace, as they are descended exclusively from Amerindian peoples on the mainland of South America, but they are, or were at the very least, quite culturally distinct, as obviously becoming seafarers of the Greater and Lesser Antilles produced far different lifestyle and tradition from other Amerindians. The Taino, Caribs, and Lucans of the Caribbean were all uniformly wiped out shortly after contact with the Old World, mostly through disease, and those that did survive, in the Spanish Caribbean at least, were intermixed with the mulatto and Criollo population, many of whom had ancestry from the Canary Islands, to create the modern nations of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. So interestingly, these modern groups have major ancestry from two completely assimilated groups, the Guanche and the Taino. So although they went extinct in their homelands, their genetics and culture live on in these countries and in immigrant communities in the United States and elsewhere. Although many other individual ethnic groups from the Americas had disappeared or been assimilated in history since European colonization, none have suffered the same absolutist fate of the Taino, and none in such a large-scale fashion. So, although through the European colonization of the Americas, some groups of Amerindians were completely wiped out, another area of the planet that I've discussed in great detail in the past has undergone a radical demographic transformation, although certainly not in recent history. This is the story not only of a lost race, but also of a lost continent. As many know, Southeast Asia is made up of the peninsular region known as Indochina, stretching from Vietnam to Myanmar, as well as the insular region composed of the Philippines, parts of Malaysia, and Indonesia, collectively known as the Malay Archipelago. But this was not always so. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, the sea levels were far lower than they were today, creating a massive landmass in the place of the Malay Archipelago, dubbed by geologists as Sundaland. Sundaland connected the mainland of Asia with Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and parts of the Philippines, meaning if any civilization could claim a connection to Atlantis, it would be here. And also during this period, Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea were connected as a single island as well, known as Sahul. It is believed that some of the first early Homo sapiens that left Africa traveled along the coast of the Indian Ocean, with many settling along the way in a process of thousands of years, and those that settled in Sundaland were quite distinct from the population we see there today. The people of Sundaland, Sahul, and the Indian subcontinent became the modern race that we recognize as the Australoids, also known as Vadoids or Oceanians, although in South Asia they became very heavily intermixed with groups of incoming Eastern and Western Eurasians to create the unique people groups we see today, and the inhabitants of Sahul became the Australian Aborigines and Papuans, who are very culturally and genetically disparate from just about every population on Earth due to their isolation. The inhabitants of Sundaland were indeed quite diverse, inhabiting a large area, but following the mass migration of East Asians from the north approximately 10,000 years ago, the vast majority of its people were killed or assimilated. So the people of the Sundaland may not have entirely gone extinct, as remnant populations such as the Aita, Aslians, or Andamanese still do exist in squat clusters in the islands of the Philippines and Andamans, with the Aslians being the last remains of this once widespread group on the mainland of Asia, although all Southeast Asians have some degree of admixture from this once widespread group. There were many other groups I wish to discuss in today's video, but unfortunately just didn't have the time. So please let me know your thoughts on these once widespread, but now extinct groups of humans. And for today's poll, let me know which one of these races or sub-races of people you would like to learn more about. And as always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.